Tim Longo has become one of the most recognized and well-known police officers in America. The chief of the City of Charlottesville Police Department, he led the investigation in the search for Hannah Graham. He led the investigation into a search for truth about the Rolling Stone article about rape on campus at UVA. Tim Longo recently announced his retirement. He'll step down in May. Coming up, my exclusive exit interview with Charlottesville Chief of Police, Tim Longo. Chief Longo, thank you for being here. I appreciate your time.
Coy, thank you for having me.
I want to ask you about that period of time, the search for Hannah Graham, the discovery of her remains, which was followed by Jackie's story in Rolling Stone, which was followed by the violent arrest of Martese Johnson on the UVA corner by ABC agents. All of that on your beat and under your leadership. That you had to deal with. You've told a reporter that when asked to describe that period, you've said it was hell on earth. What did you mean by that?
Some of the most painful experiences of my career, and it felt like it wasn't going to end, like it was almost perpetual. By the grace of God, there were endings. They weren't necessarily the endings that we wanted in some of those cases. But there was resolution. And I guess the flip side of it, though, is look at it from the positive perspective of how well this community, not the police department, but this entire community, how well we performed on an international stage in ways that communities really can emulate. And I think we should be very proud of that. Even during the most difficult times that we faced, we came out of it, I think, a better place.
Charlottesville had to get used to all these satellite trucks in town. CNN was here. You were thrust into the national spotlight on more than one occasion, at the podium, in the middle of a scrum of reporters from around the country wanting to know your every thought and what was happening. What was that like, to be that guy in the middle of all that?
It's a privilege to be that guy, to be that person who can bring calm to a storm, that can demonstrate that there, in the midst of chaos, there is control. There are people that are in positions of leadership that have competencies and skills that will get this community through difficult times. I think people needed to see that. It needed to be visible. They needed to be reassured that the department was functioning at its highest level, and that there was leadership in place, collective leadership, not just positional leadership, but collective relational leadership in place to get us through really difficult times. And I also think it was then an opportunity for me to communicate a message to a broader group of people that needed to hear our story, that needed to know what they could do to help us, in Hannah's case particularly. And I think that paid great dividends at the end.
I believe Jessie Matthew was the last person she was seen with before she vanished off the face of the earth. Because it's been a week and we can't find her.
You were sharply criticized by some, I guess to your face and behind your back both, for being too emotional.
Sure.
During some of those press conferences during the search for Hannah Graham. Wiping a tear from your eye, yelling into the camera, to the nation, saying, you know, Hannah is out there somewhere.
Right.
We have to find her. What's your response now, looking back to that criticism that you were too emotional at that time?
Well, let me start by saying I always welcome constructive criticism to my face. I absolutely resent criticism behind my back, particularly from people who've never met Tim Longo, who don't know Tim Longo, who've never exchanged a word with Tim Longo, and to have the audacity to call into question my character and I resent that, very much so. Having said that, I think my style of communications worked in this case. I think the message was heard loud and clear. It was heard in a place called Galveston, Texas, where a woman was able to look at at someone and say, I know that image. And she knew what to do. And it changed the course of this investigation in many ways. I will never apologize for who I am. I'm an emotional person. I've always been an emotional person. And I'm not going to change that. And if that's all you can criticize me for, I'll welcome that criticism. Just pay me the respect of criticizing me to my face, and not behind a computer keyboard or behind my back.
What was the toughest moment in the search for Hannah Graham for you personally? And what do you think was the toughest moment for your team that you were leading?
I think every second of every moment, every day of every week of every month that we were engaged in that process was difficult for our team. You know, a lot of focus on investigators and the investigative process, but there were patrol officers too who oftentimes were wondering kind of where we were in this investigation, and perhaps more importantly what they could do to help. And that was frustrating for them. It was tiring to know that your department was engaged in something that may or may not have had an ending. So that was difficult. For me personally, it was waking up every day and wondering whether that day would be the day that we could fulfill a promise. And then behind that promise would probably be a really difficult task, and that would be to share what we found and where we were in the investigation with Mom and Dad. And so that was hard, and that wasn't something that frankly I had to address. There were others that had that conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Graham. And I suspect for those people it was a very difficult part of their life, of their career, and one of those moments that will not be forgotten.
I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for you, after searching so diligently for so long, and I guess for all of us, to find Hannah but not to have found her alive, and to bring her home safe and sound. But I guess everybody was prepared for that.
I think so. I didn't want to be that person to put out a candle of hope in the hearts and minds of her parents, her brother, her family overseas, her friends. I didn't want to be that person, but I think everyone involved came to a point in the process where we recognized how our role had shifted. And we did so silently, but we continued to go about our work. But the result was we fulfilled a promise, and that at least in the minds of her parents and families and friends, at least they could have a sense of comfort to know that in some way she was returned.
The whole episode of Rolling Stone and Jackie's story, a sensational story that has since been retracted, and that most people today who've looked at it believe there's no evidence to support that story. That said, what's the takeaway from that whole episode for you? It really speaks a lot to the relationship between the City of Charlottesville Police Department, the University of Virginia Police Department, the university at large. For you, as the Chief of Police in Charlottesville, what was the takeaway that you'd like people to think about as we remember that whole episode, and as we look forward to lawsuits that will probably be going to court?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think the greatest takeaway for me personally, but also I think for this community, is a bigger and frankly more serious dialogue about how such offenses get reported to the police, and how they play out in a system like a university system, which is very complicated, very complex. The administration of this university caught a lot of heat during the course of all of that, but I think a tremendous amount of courage was exercised to open the doors of this place to a police investigation, respecting all federal laws that govern how records in educational institutions are handled. Setting that aside, they still opened the doors to this institution up to an investigation that we took very seriously. I mean, these were outrageous allegations that needed to be investigated. It's unfortunate we couldn't come to a firm resolution, but I think it was important for us to be able to, in a very public way, and frankly in a very detailed way, kind of an unprecedented way in which to kind of lay out the investigative steps that were taken to bring some closure to that investigation. It was a difficult one.
And your investigation didn't really find much evidence, if any, to support the allegations that were made by Jackie.
The investigation resulted in a finding of no substantive evidence to support the details of that claim. And again, as I said then, I will say now, I can't say, I don't think any one of us here can say that nothing happened that day or that night. What I can tell you is that our investigation revealed no substantive basis to believe that the facts as they were presented in that article were true.
Yeah. We had a UVA student who was arrested. She was buying a bottle of water at the Barracks Road Shopping Center in Charlottesville, arrested by ABC agents. That made national news. ABC agents also arrested another UVA student not too much later, right across the street from the university, a violent arrest that required 10 stitches in his head when he fell to the ground or was thrown to the ground.
I go to UVA! I go to UVA! I go to UVA! Fighting! You f***ing racist! Behind your back! You f***ing racist!
How should we make sense of that? From where you sit as the chief of police and the ABC agents in Charlottesville, what do we make of these stories?
Yeah, I don't know that it would be appropriate for me to critique a state agency. I think that's been done at the most appropriate levels. A state police investigation, intervention by the governor's office by way of executive order, a review by our Commonwealth attorney, all of which reached certain conclusions about that particular incident. Having said that, even though it was a situation that did not involve the local police, I thought it was very important for this community, folks around the state and around the country that were watching Charlottesville once again, to hear from its police chief and this police department about how we go about our work and the importance of relational policing and fundamental fairness in carrying out our duties and responsibilities in a way that embrace community and don't push them away. That situation created a tremendous amount of strain with respect to the relationship between local law enforcement and the young men and women who come here and call this their home, at least for 9 months. Tremendous amount of strain. But what came of that was communication, dialogue, and building of relationship, and a far greater bond that exists today than exists then with respect to organizations, student organizations here on grounds that expressed a tremendous amount of concern about what happened that night on the university corner.
We're going to take a really quick break, and when we get back, I want to talk to you about the future of policing in America and the reaction in Baltimore to the death of Freddie Gray and constitutional policing. That's coming up. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Chief Longo, I understand that you've been called as a witness in some of the cases regarding the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. So we know that there's some specifics of these cases that you can't discuss. So let's talk broad strokes here. Sure. Let's talk about Baltimore. Let's talk about maybe some of your memories as a beat cop coming up on some of the most dangerous, deadly streets in America. The Wire was actually written about your years on the Baltimore police force and the Baltimore that you really know. How do we make sense of the death of Freddie Gray and what's going on in Baltimore?
You know, as you pointed out, Coy, it would really be inappropriate for me specifically to talk about that case. So let me go to your initial questions about my impressions of those days many years ago. I walked those very streets, those very same communities that played out across the nation this past spring and the riots that took place in Baltimore City as a result to the death of Freddie Gray. I walked those neighborhoods. I spent time in those very neighborhoods. And I never felt that tension. I never felt that fracture between police and community so deep as it is now. And it's an example of other places around this country. And it's not for me to question how that fracture came about, but it didn't happen overnight. It came about over a period of time. And I think the people who were best in a position to recognize what was happening either ignored the fracture or didn't see it for what it was and what it is, which is a breakdown in police-community relations, which causes us to really have to rethink the way we do policing in America and this whole notion of relational policing that I've talked so much about over the past year or 18 months.
You've also talked about constitutional policing. Connect those dots for us. Constitutional policing, what is that?
Yeah.
And relational policing, and do they have anything to do with each other?
They have absolutely everything to do with each other. Relational policing is about trust. This term community policing, in my opinion, has gotten stale over time. What community policing is really about is relationships, and what relationship is really about is trust. When you have trust, you can begin to have communication, you can begin to build relationship. And those things require what has been termed as legitimacy. People have to view the police department in their community as a legitimate source, as a legitimate entity, as a legitimate body that they can work collaboratively with to make their community better. You know how I feel about our Constitution and about the principles of constitutional policing and the importance of policing strategies to be in line with constitutional principles. But where I think we've gone wrong over the years, I've said this many times over the past several months, is we began to view the Constitution as the ceiling, when it's really the floor. It's really the baseline. There are things that we can go about in our work as police officers and not run afoul of the Constitution. But the question is, do those strategies conflict with community expectations? I mean, there are many things that police agencies do around this country that are constitutionally sound, that drive a wedge between them and the community. One example that I use, and again, I'm not questioning the constitutionality of this strategy, but one of the examples that I use is our consent searches. That is asking citizens for consent to search their persons or their property. Consent searches have very little return on investment. Very rarely do they yield evidence of a crime or a contraband. And so the question is, should we be deploying that kind of policing strategy when all it's doing is driving a wedge between the police and the community? And that's just an example of one of many policing strategies that I think over time we really do need to rethink. And as we move forward in this 21st century, particularly in light of the President's 21st Century Policing Report, which I have said and believe to be a substantive roadmap for policing in the future, one of the things we need to really focus on is, in an effort to restore public trust and confidence in what we do, is look at our policing strategy and work closely with the community to develop policing strategies in a collaborative way that don't create divide. And that's going to be a challenge. That's a challenge for the 21st century police leader, the 21st century police officer, is to really step back and rethink our strategies.
And arguably more of a challenge now than it has been in the modern age. I mean, it seems like every week we see that the police have shot and killed somebody else in the streets.
Yes, I think so. You know, a lot of, you mentioned being called as a witness, and lots of folks don't know. I have for many years have served as a police practices expert, mostly in civil rights claims. Very rarely in criminal cases, but mostly in civil rights claims. And a lot of those claims are on behalf of plaintiffs, or people who have brought lawsuits against police agencies and police officers and the municipalities to employ them, that employ those persons. So I have a really good sense of the issues that are occurring across our country, and have a really good understanding of how to begin to help other police agencies move forward around improving policing strategies. And frankly, that's what I hope to do after May the 1st when I walk away from this uniform and go into a mode in which I think I can have a broader impact on my profession.
What do you think is the key to that? Which really we're talking about a cultural change among many in law enforcement. What's the key to that moving forward? What's the key to cultivating that trust between law enforcement and communities? What's the key to getting past this fracturing, as you say, that isn't just a problem in Baltimore? It's a problem in much of America that we have today, and especially among communities of people of color and who are poor, who've been saying this has been going on for generations. I know there's no one solution to this challenge.
Right.
But for you, based on the years of practice that you've had doing just this kind of thing, what are some of the keys you can point to where you can say, you know what, we know for a fact that this works?
There's lots of evidence-based strategies in policing and across the criminal justice continuum. Those evidence-based strategies are already in place. They already exist. This is really about changing culture. It's about changing the way we look at this business. And it gets back to the relational police. A lot of what we do every day is interact with people in many different ways, many times not in an enforcement role. And we miss opportunities to build relationships. And I've said several times, other chiefs around the country have said several times, many times over the past 18 months, every citizen contact matters. Every citizen interaction is an opportunity to change the way people look at us. You know, there was a retired police chief who came to do some training here in Charlottesville about communication skills. And he was talking to one of my young sergeants about moving forward. And the sergeant said, this is a really difficult time in policing. And he looked at the sergeant and he said, no, Bobby, we've never been stronger as a profession. There's never been a greater opportunity to change the way people look at American policing. It's about changing the culture and the mindset.
Do you think law enforcement is ready for this kind of change?
Absolutely. That's what I think the retired chief meant when he said we've never been stronger as a profession. I think there are men and women in this business that embrace that notion and have the willingness to move it forward, but it's going to take time. These relationships didn't become fractured overnight, and they're not going to be healed. They're not going to be restored overnight.
You talk about relational policing, and I'm reminded of a photograph that is in your office on a shelf of you as a young beat cop talking to a citizen, a woman on her front stoop in Baltimore.
Right.
You learned this kind of stuff as a young man, didn't you?
I learned it from my father. It's about solving problems, and you can't solve problems as an individual. You got to solve problems with people that are willing to collaborate. And that's what I did as a young police officer. Is I got to know the people who lived where I came to work every day, and I got to know their name, and I got to build relationships and develop trust, so that when I needed to solve a problem on my beat, on my post, there were people that were willing to help me solve that problem.
You have announced your retirement. I believe you're stepping down in May of this year. What's next? And how do you want to continue to contribute to finding the solution and finding a path forward to realize what could be the best century for policing in America? And historians could look back at this time as a real sad period before a wonderful renaissance of policing and trust and getting over this fracturing that you talk about.
I have a long list of projects already. I'll be working in 2 different cities in America to do police reform over a period of years. I'll be doing more training of police officers across the country, not only on legal issues, but cultural issues as well. I do this great program called Breaking the Cycle of Mediocrity, which is breaking down that subset of culture in an organization that keeps it from moving forward. Talking with our law school here about doing some seminar work or maybe some adjunct work. I think I want to be able to do things that will continue to impact my profession in a positive way but in a broader way. And so those are my plans. That's the next several years of my life, I hope, God willing.
How will you look back on this time in Charlottesville? There's some really tragic moments of crisis during your tenure. As you look back on this period, what do you take with you?
Everything. Everything. I have no regrets. This has been a great profession to me. This city's been a great place to raise my family. There's not an hour of any day that passes that someone in this town doesn't come up and express a word of thanks or appreciation or a kind thought. It's the character of this community. And I've been very privileged to be given the opportunity to serve here. And that's why I'll continue to call this home even long after retirement.
Tim Longo, thank you for your service to Charlottesville and to this country. We appreciate your time very much.
Sir.
We'll be right back. I want to again extend my thanks to Tim Longo for taking some time to talk. And I want to thank him for his leadership and his service to the city of Charlottesville and the Central Virginia community. His critical vision about policing in America is a message that every member of law enforcement in this country should heed. In Charlottesville, this little city I love, I'm Coy Barefoot. Have a great week, and y'all be good to each other.